thank you, Trevor, and thank you all for coming out for us today. I tried to share with everybody that walked in my card, but I had to run to the podium. So if you do not have my card, be sure to pick it up afterward. Happy to receive your call if there's anything that this presentation highlights that might be useful for you. I learned about Mercatus when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors. I arrived in the summer of 2005. You know, I'm a policy geek. You see I'm kind of an academic geek as well. And I thought this is great. I get to go to these think tank events. And Mercatus was one of the first events that I went to. And it was just a fabulous event. I fell in love with the kind of work that they're doing, bridging the gap between really rigorous academic research and making it accessible to policymakers as well. And I was honored when I got a call a year or so ago to come and join them and for opportunities like this one today. What I want to talk about today is sort of the current state of economic opportunity in the United States in a debate that is ongoing. It's not a new debate. It's actually a quite old debate. It's a debate that occurred during the Great Depression, and that is, are we experiencing a new normal? After the Great Depression, there's a theory developed about secular stagnation, that this time is different. We sort of ran out of our good luck. The things that used to work aren't going to work in the future, and this is, you know, this is what we have, and we should just make do with it. And you're starting to hear that story again. It's a story that I don't agree with, and I'll argue against it. And my colleague Robin Bowen in the back there likes to refer to this deck that's in front of you as the parade of horribles. And you know, I grew up in the South Chicago. It's not the most optimistic place in the United States, and so I'm trying to recover, and I'm trying to get better. And you'll see at the end, I actually try and get happy and point out some things that we can do and improve matters. And so I'll try and turn the conversation in that direction as well. In the two policy areas that I'll cover today is labor force participation and financial and monetary markets. So those would be the two pillars of this talk, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. All right, I'm going to stick on this slide, and I'm going to keep it up here just to focus. We're going to talk about several policies kind of at the 10,000-foot level. But this pulls it all together. These are data from just after the Second World War until today. And what you see is the blue line is the trend growth for the United States during this period. And if you were to push that timeline back, you'd see the same trend. It's about a 3% trend growth rate. And what you also see is you see a red line, and that's deviations from the trend. And we don't deviate much from that trend. Notice in the early 1980s, there was a severe recession. In fact, there was a double dip recession in the early 1980s. Throughout that period, there are deviations from trend, recessions. Throughout that period, we almost immediately snap back to trend growth. This time is different. We are leaving that gap. As you look at the end of that graph, the far right side of that graph, the gap between the red and the blue curves, that's $1 trillion gap. That's not $1 trillion one time. That's $1 trillion. We're falling short $1 trillion each of the years of our economic recovery. That translates to about $15,000 per household. We hear a lot about wage stagnation. We hear a lot about income inequality. You know, we can go down the line. We're leaving $1 trillion on the table every year, and we're about 6 years into a recovery. Right? That is big. That's the difficulty that we face, and that's you know, in an important sense. Highlights the policy opportunities that are in front of us. How do we close that gap? $1 trillion. Where do you start? That's a big number. Well, start where a lot of the money is. And it turns out that about a quarter of that gap can be rationalized by the decline in labor force participation. And so there's been a considerable decline in labor force participation. Of course, we've had unemployment rates decreasing, but that's different than the decline in labor force participation. And depending on the assumptions you make, in conservative assumptions, you can account for about a quarter of that gap from the decline in labor force participation. And so then policy-wise, if you think that the decline in labor force participation is a big part of that gap and you want to close that gap, which I think everybody does, what would you want to do? Well, you'd want to make it easier for employers to hire people, and you'd want to maximize the reward to working. So the next question is, what are we doing? Well, we're making it harder to hire people, and we're not maximizing the rewards to working. All right, so let's talk about a couple of those features of current policy. If we look at the ACA, Casey Mulligan, University of Chicago economist, Mercatus scholar, he estimates that for every large employer that hires a worker without health insurance, that employer is facing a $2,000 penalty per employee. So then one might say, well, that's an easy one to fix, isn't it? Just offer a health insurance benefit and you would avoid that $2,000 penalty. Well, it turns out that our tax code is very complicated, and we'll have more to say about that throughout this presentation. Very complicated tax code, and part of what that does is it changes the effective price that the employer is facing for, say, a $15,000 health insurance benefit and what the employee is receiving. And so under reasonable assumptions, the employer for a $15,000 benefit, insurance benefit, is going to pay $14,000 or so. The employee, after taxes, after you take into account the tax effects, is getting something like an $11,000 tax benefit. Now think about that. The employer saying, hey, I would hire you on the margin if you make me $14,000 more. The employer saying, I would work if I get, something north of $11,000 more on the margin. In between, you're in no man's land. Suppose you're a $12,000 person. Well, you need at least $12,000. The employer needs considerably more, given this gap that is created by the tax code. We're also reducing the rewards to working. There's a recent paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Jeffrey Clemens at the University of California in San Diego is one of the authors there. And they put together a clever identification strategy to estimate how much minimum wages are decreasing employment. And they find that it's considerable. It decreases experience. And again, it holds people back from reaching their opportunity. And lastly, more on the tax complications, and just in terms of compliance costs. It's complicated. April 15th is right around the corner. I suspect many of you who are like me have spent a considerable amount of time already this year putting together records, trying to remember what you did, what you didn't do. Eddie Lazier at Stanford University estimates that just the compliance costs alone are costing us 1% of GDP. 1% of GDP. Now, if you're not into math and finance and the rest of it, 1% sounds like a small number. 1% is huge. So most of you are on sort of the younger side of the age distribution in this room, and those for 25, 30 years old. What this means is compounding over a generation. Your kids are facing something like a 40% pay cut. Right? Just by the compliance costs, you compound that over a generation, and that turns into about a 40% pay cut. That's the difference on a per capita basis between the United States today and Japan today. right? Japan's got, we're talking about lost decades in Japan. And here we are, just because of complications in our tax code, we're throwing that away. Right? Simplifications are available, and they're actually being talked about quite a bit around town. And so this is when I started to put the happy face on. If you looked at the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago, there's an article highlighting some of the talk around this town on a bipartisan basis, looking to simplify the tax code along these margins, getting rid of these cliffs that hold people back from reaching for their opportunities that they see in front of them. Another idea that's being discussed is Eddie Lazier, Jason, I mentioned before, from Stanford, Jason Fichtner at the Mercatus Center have both proposed in different ways full expensing of investment. And so what full expensing of investment effectively does is it turns the revenue generation into a consumption tax, right? So if you think about if you were to expense all investment, the only thing left to tax is when you consume things, right? And there are several ideas that are running around along those lines that would lower and flatten rates. There are other things. None of this is to argue against benefit programs. None of this is to argue against generating revenue. It's to get the distortions out of the benefit programs, and it's to get the distortions out of the tax code. If you were to sort of pile up these regulations and benefit programs and you know, interact it with the tax code, you know, in the state of Pennsylvania, what you would find, you know, imagine in the state of Pennsylvania, a single mom goes to work. She's making $30,000 a year. Her boss knocks on her door. It's annual review time, and it's great news. You're doing so well, we're going to double your pay. You're making $30,000 now, we're going to give you $60,000. All sorts of new responsibilities, all sorts of you know, benefits. We're going to double your pay. She's got to think twice. Given the way the tax code interacts with the benefit programs, she has to make closer to $70,000 to make that work for her. Right? Again, you've got these big gaps between where you're standing today in the tax code and in our benefit programs to where you want to go, and there's a valley in between. And it discourages people from reaching for and fulfilling their opportunities. And the last thing I want to talk about before we open up for discussion is financial regulations, financial and monetary regulations. For as difficult as what I've said sounds so far, that is the complexities in our benefits and in our tax system, all of that takes a back seat to financial regulation and monetary regulation. If the financial system doesn't work and monetary policy doesn't work, we're not even thinking about the tax code. And that used to unfortunately be, I should say, that used to fortunately be a hard argument to make until 2008 came along. People, you know, like to argue that financial sector is about Wall Street and it's something else that goes on and it doesn't affect me. But 2008, I think, was pretty clear. It affects all of us. You know, think about what finance is. It's simply getting together good ideas with the resources in the discipline to take those good ideas and see them to their productive ends. It's just a series of contracts. It's super important if you understand it that way. It's super important for economic opportunity. If we don't innovate, we can't make more with less. We can't expand the economic pie without making more with less, and we can't make more with less unless we have something that is getting ideas off of the paper, out of people's heads and into action. Something needs to bridge that gap, and that's what finance does. And think about monetary policy as well. You know, what is money? You know, why do we walk around and we give people little green pieces of paper with presidents on them, and then they do stuff for us, right? It's remarkable, right? is because we trust that that little green piece of paper is going to be a store of value, that we have a stable currency. And you think about, you know, the importance of that stability in facilitating transactions. You know, I go out, I like coffee, go out and I get a cup of coffee. And then you say, oh, you know what you need to do is, I need an economic lecture to give you the cup of coffee. Nobody asks me that. Nobody asks me what I do. They have no idea what I do. I give them a little green piece of paper, and they trust that that's a claim check, that I did something valuable for somebody, and I just gave them a claim check that says to the next person in line that they did something valuable for me. And we trust that these claim checks are going to exchange freely. And all of that depends on whether those claim checks are stable, a stable store of value. And there are a number of policy ideas running around this town about how to reform the Federal Reserve. And we could think about them. One is auditing the Fed. I was a financial statement auditor. I know what audits are. Sounds like a good idea to some people. I worry about it. Why do I worry about it? I worry about institutions. I worry about laws that depend on who's sitting in the chair. As an economist, I'd much rather rely on strong incentives for whoever is sitting in the chair. So I worry a bit about auditing the Fed. Another proposal is to ask the Fed to state a policy rule and then to inform Congress on why it might have departed from that policy rule during the last 6 months or so. Again, sounds like a good idea, but let's think about it a little bit. You know, we like to economize on pollution, and you may remember, you know, for sort of coal-fired energy plants, we try to reduce emissions from coal-fired energy plants. And you know, one approach would be to mandate that these plants employ scrubbers in the stacks to sort of scrub things clean. But as an economist, you don't really want to tell people how to do it. What you want to do is you want to say, we don't care how you do it, we just care that it gets done. So then we say, look, pollute less, and if scrubbers is the low-cost way to pollute less, then do it. There may be other ways that whoever's running the energy plant can use to reduce pollution. We're interested in the low-cost way, and the people that are closest to the information and have the best incentives to do so, leave it up to them. Now, this idea on the policy rule really doesn't go all the way there. It says, hey, Fed, you choose the rule. We're not telling the Fed per se to use scrubbers. We're not telling them how to do it in this proposal, but it's not that far away from it, and I worry about crossing over that line. More immediately, what I worry about is, notice that the way I teed this up is I said that we want to ask the Fed to tell us what rule it's using. The Fed, what is the Fed? It's not one person. In fact, there are 19 people sitting around the policy table at each of the FOMC meetings. There are 12 district banks, and there are 7 governors on the Board of Governors. Each one of them, well, the 7 governors have a research staff. They're getting ideas from the research staff on, hey, you know what should monetary policy look like? Each of the 12 district bankers is getting a research briefing from his or her district as well. They're getting different briefings. They're coming to the table with different rules. I would come to the table with a different rule than some of the governors or some of the presidents. They differ from me. I've worked in this area quite a bit. If they were to ask the Fed, what rule are you using? We'd all have different answers. Well, maybe not all of us would have different answers. There'd be some agreement, but there'd be a lot of diversity in the types of rules that the different people that are participating in this meeting are working. So it may not even be, even if we got over some of the difficulties that I highlighted, it may be hard to implement. So what's the happy note to end on here? It's an idea that's getting bipartisan support. Recently, Richard Fisher stepped down as president and CEO of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. And he proposed, rather than having, as we sit here today, 5 district bankers vote in every FOMC meeting, and they rotate through the 12. He's proposing to have 6 district bankers vote every meeting, right? And this is important. Why is this important? Well, the district bankers come to the table with a different set of incentives than do the governors, right? It matters how you come to the table. I mentioned there were 19 people sitting around this table. They have different incentives. The 7 governors are nominated by the presidency of the United States, and they're confirmed by the Senate. Now ask yourself, if you were a politician, if you were an elected official, or you were running for office, what are your incentives? Well, you need to do things for people. Well, how are you going to do things for people? You have to pay for it. Well, one way you could do things for people is you can tax them. Then you can pay for it. That's not very popular. So you have to get the money elsewhere. Another thing you could do is you could borrow the money. A little bit easier maybe on certain margins, but still pretty unpopular. I've yet to run into many people that, given the chance, wouldn't just print money for themselves. I mean, think about that. If you could print money, wouldn't you? We have a home in Montana, and there are guys, you know, there's a bar not too far from where we live. Printers are really good, right? You could print, you can copy bills really easily. They had $50 bills, and they were paying for drinks. They were buying the whole bar of drinks with their $50 bills, and they were bragging that they really, you know, they had made the $50 bills. Unfortunately, they put Lincoln on the $50 bill, right? I mean, there's a strong incentive to print money. You look around the world, and even throughout our history here in the United States, you see that incentive coming to the fore. And it's rooted in those incentives. How do those incentives for the 7 governors of the Federal Reserve Board, how do they differ than the 12 district bankers? Well, think about how the 12 come to the table. They're nominated by their district's board of directors. Who are those directors? 2/3 of those directors are commercial bankers who make fixed rate loans. Who doesn't like inflation? If you're making fixed rate loans, you don't like inflation. Those are the guys that are the inflation hawks. And when you look at the data, the 12 vote for significantly tighter monetary policy than do the 7. It aligns with the, right? I mean, these are economic stories that you can tell your mom that, and she understands that if you make fixed rate loans, you don't like inflation. 7 come to the table with no interest in that, or they're not immediately connected to that interest. 12 come to the table with an immediate interest. Right? And former President Fisher's proposal would give a stronger voice to those 12. Representative Brady, also from Texas, Republican, he has a similar proposal. He wants all 12 of the district bankers to vote in every meeting. In either way, what you're going to do is, and there are other ideas running around town, but along those lines, think about those incentives. What are the incentives of the people coming to the table? Why is money so important for economic opportunity? And let's get those decisions into the hands of the people who are most interested in that opportunity. And so I wanted to just close then with a quote maybe as motivation for how important I see some of these opportunities in front of us are. And that's from Adam Smith. He says that, or said, to prohibit a great people from making all that they can of every part of their own produce, or from employing their stock in industry in the way they judge most advantageous to themselves is a manifest violation of the most sacred rights of mankind. We're leaving $1 trillion on the table every year of this recovery. Some are calling it a secular stagnation. We should just give up. I see a lot of low-hanging policy fruit where people in this room can be doing, helping us do a lot better. So I'll end there and look forward to our discussion.